In this section, we're going to discuss debt-to-income ratios. In the industry, they're commonly referred to as DTI. Debt-to-income ratios are used to evaluate the borrower's capacity or the ability to afford the mortgage for which you were trying to qualify them. There's two ratios that are commonly used, the front end and the back end, also called the primary and the secondary. Oftentimes with automated underwriting systems, only the back end is used. But when we're talking about underwriting guidelines, it's often you'll see something like ratio requirements of 28/36. That's a standard conventional ratio. That means that the front end ratio requirement is 28 and the back end requirement is 36. You may also see something like 31/43, which is the FHA requirement. That just means that the front end ratio requirement is 31 and the back end ratio requirement is 43. So let's talk about what we mean by front end and back end. The front end ratio includes all of the payments associated with the house, so the taxes, the insurance, the principal and interest, the mortgage insurance if applicable, and the HOA if applicable. You take the sum of all those numbers and you divide that by the monthly income, and that gives you the front end ratio. The back end ratio is that number for the housing payment that we just calculated, plus all of the other borrower's obligations, such as car payments, utility payments are not included, credit card payments would be included. The math is not difficult. The most difficult part on the back end ratio is determining what numbers are included and what numbers are not included. Before we get into the details of what to include and what not to include, let's just do a few simple calculations. Okay, in our example here, we see that the house payment, and just for simplicity's sake, we're going to say that includes all the taxes, insurance, mortgage insurance, principal and interest, and everything else is $1,500. All the other debts that we are going to count, again, we're just going to simplify and say we're going to use all $500 of that. The monthly debts are $500, and the monthly income for the borrower is $4,500. So if we want to figure the front end ratio, we're just going to take the monthly payment and divide that by the monthly income. So it's a fairly easy math calculation. It's just $1,500 divided by $4,500. And when you do that on your calculator, you get an answer of 0.33. So the front end ratio is 33%. For the back end ratio, we take the $1,500, add that to the $500, and then divide that total by the $4,500. So when you add the $1,500 and the $500, that gives you $2,000. You're going to divide that by the $4,500, which is their monthly income. And that gives you a back-end debt ratio of 0.44. So their back-end ratio is 0.44 or 44%. So the debt-to-income ratios for this borrower, we can say that they are 33/44. 33 being the front-end ratio, and 44 being the back-end ratio. Now let's get into more detail about what numbers you actually use in the secondary or back-end debt ratio and which ones you don't. An overriding good principle to follow is if it's on the credit report, you need to use it. If it's not on the credit report, there's a very good chance that you do not need to include that in the back-end debt ratio. The only exception to that are payments like child support and alimony, for which a borrower is legally obligated. Those do need to be included in the back-end debt ratio. For things like electricity payments, for example, those do not need to be included. Cell phone payments, cable TV payments, those types of payments do not need to be included. One way to think about it, which doesn't always apply, is if the borrower stops paying that payment, what's going to happen? In the case of the utility payment, their lights are going to be shut off, but they don't have an ongoing debt. Whereas on a car payment, if they stop making their payment, then the bank's going to continue to want to make those payments made or have those payments made. So it doesn't always hold true, but it's a good rule of thumb to use. The easiest is the credit report. If it's on the credit report, you need to count it. If it's not, most likely you don't unless it's child support or alimony. So let's go through this list and talk about what things we do need to count and which ones we don't.